The summer of 1914 erupted in a blaze that would consume the world in unprecedented violence. Europe, a continent bristling with alliances and rivalries, plunged into a conflict that no one truly anticipated in its scope and brutality. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary on June 28, 1914, acted as the spark in a powder keg of political tensions. Within weeks, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, drawing in Russia, Germany, France, and eventually Britain. The war that started as a series of rapid mobilizations and expected short battles soon ground into something far more grim and enduring: trench warfare. The Western Front, stretching roughly 700 kilometers from the North Sea through Belgium and northern France to the Swiss border, became the epicenter of this horrific new style of combat. Early hopes for a swift victory were dashed as the armies encountered the harsh reality of modern firepower. Machine guns, rapid-firing artillery, and barbed wire created an impassable barrier to traditional infantry charges. In response, soldiers began to dig, first shallow foxholes, then intricate networks of trenches, bunkers, and communication lines. These trenches were the crucible of a new kind of warfare, one defined not by rapid maneuvers but by endurance, attrition, and relentless suffering. By late 1914, the Western Front had solidified into a vast, static network of trenches stretching from the North Sea ports of Belgium to the Swiss Alps. Soldiers on both sides faced a grim routine, standing in waterlogged trenches, surrounded by mud and the omnipresent threat of enemy fire, while the sounds of artillery barrages and distant cries became their constant companions. Life in the trenches was a mixture of monotony, terror, and camaraderie. Rats and lice thrived in the damp, unsanitary conditions, and disease was as deadly as any bullet or shell. Yet, amid this desolation, soldiers formed bonds that would endure far beyond the war. The early months of trench warfare were marked by experimentation. Commanders tried new tactics to break the stalemate, mining operations beneath enemy lines, creeping artillery barrages, and night raids. Yet the technology of the time had outpaced strategy, leaving both sides locked in a brutal, grinding contest of wills. Each advance, however small, exacted an enormous toll in human life. Entire regiments could be decimated over a few hundred meters of no man's land, the strip of exposed terrain separating opposing trenches, which often became synonymous with death itself. The psychological impact of the trenches was profound. Soldiers lived under the constant shadow of death, the roar of artillery becoming a lullaby of dread. Many developed what would later be recognized as shell shock, a combination of extreme stress, trauma, and neurological symptoms resulting from continuous bombardment and the horrors witnessed daily. Letters sent home often painted a sanitized picture, hiding the squalor, fear, and despair that define trench life. Meanwhile, propaganda sought to maintain morale and justify the carnage, often portraying the enemy as monstrous while glorifying the supposed heroism of the frontline troops. By 1915, both the Allies and the Central Powers had adapted to the demands of trench warfare. Defensive positions became more sophisticated: deep dugouts, reinforced bunkers, machine gun nests, and intricate networks of barbed wire. Offensive operations, however, remained deadly gambles. The battlefields of France and Belgium became laboratories for new forms of warfare, as generals sought to break the deadlock with artillery, gas, and innovative strategies. Yet the essence of the conflict, relentless, grinding, attritional combat, persisted, defining the Western Front as a theater of endurance, suffering, and unyielding human resilience. Trench warfare was not only a physical battle but also a psychological and social crucible. For the soldiers of the Western Front, life in the trenches was a relentless mix of danger, monotony, and struggle for survival. These narrow, mud-filled ditches stretched for miles, zigzagging across the landscape, designed to protect men from enemy fire while offering limited mobility for attacks. They were lined with wooden planks, sandbags, and, in deeper positions, reinforced bunkers. Yet no matter how well constructed, the trenches could not shield soldiers from the elements, the omnipresent threat of artillery, or the unseen horrors that lurked in the mud. A typical day in the trenches began before dawn. Soldiers emerged from their dugouts to inspect the barbed wire, repair sandbags, and prepare for patrols into no man's land. Breakfast, if there was one, was usually cold rations, bread, hard biscuits, or tinned meat, consumed while under constant watch for enemy snipers or artillery shells. The mud and rain made every task a struggle. Boots were soaked, clothing became heavy and uncomfortable, and trench foot, a painful, debilitating condition caused by prolonged exposure to wet and unsanitary conditions, was a common affliction. Doctors and medics were overwhelmed, often lacking sufficient supplies to treat the hundreds of minor injuries that could quickly become life-threatening infections. The trenches were a breeding ground for vermin. Rats, drawn by the constant presence of decomposing bodies and food scraps, grew large and fearless. They gnawed on anything edible and sometimes even on the wounded or dead. Lice thrived in the seams of clothing and blankets, causing constant itching and spreading disease. Despite these hardships, soldiers maintained a semblance of routine. Letters from home, small comforts like chocolate or tobacco, and the camaraderie of fellow men provided brief respite from the relentless tension. Combat in the trenches was unpredictable and terrifying. Artillery barrages could begin at any moment, reducing trenches to shattered mud and timber. Soldiers learned to hug the earth, lying flat to avoid shrapnel and bullets. The psychological impact of constant bombardment led to a condition now known as shell shock, a form of severe trauma that manifested as tremors, anxiety, muteness, or even paralysis. Medical officers struggled to distinguish between physical and psychological injuries, as many soldiers were unable to continue fighting despite appearing physically unharmed. Night brought its own dangers. Patrols into no man's land were often necessary to gather intelligence, maintain barbed wire defenses, or raid enemy trenches. These excursions were perilous, exposing soldiers to snipers, mines, and sudden artillery fire. Silence, stealth, and darkness became weapons as much as rifles and bayonets. Successful raids could yield vital information or prisoners, but even small engagements left soldiers exhausted, frightened, and often disoriented. Despite the ever-present threat of death, soldiers found ways to cope. Humor, songs, and shared stories created bonds that helped them endure the relentless monotony. Officers encouraged small competitions, letter-writing campaigns, and makeshift entertainment to maintain morale. Religious services, though sporadic, offered comfort to those seeking meaning in the chaos. The sense of brotherhood, forged under fire, became a cornerstone of life in the trenches, helping men survive physically and emotionally. By 1915, both sides had refined trench systems to include multiple lines, frontline trenches for combat, support trenches to move supplies, and reserve trenches for reinforcements. Communication trenches connected these lines, allowing troops to move relatively safely behind the front. Artillery observation posts and machine gun nests were positioned to maximize defensive capability, creating a deadly web for any attacking force. Life in the trenches was not only about survival, it was also a constant tactical struggle to maintain position, observe the enemy, and exploit any weakness without exposing oneself to annihilation. Trench warfare was defined not only by mud, squalor, and endurance but also by the terrifying lethality of modern weaponry. The industrialization of war had transformed the battlefield into a landscape dominated by firepower. Soldiers were no longer facing traditional charges with muskets and bayonets, they were confronted by machine guns, heavy artillery, poison gas, and tanks, each capable of inflicting mass casualties within moments. Understanding these weapons is essential to comprehending the full horror of the Western Front. Machine guns were perhaps the most fearsome weapons encountered in the trenches. A single machine gun nest, operated by a small crew, could halt entire waves of infantry. Their rapid rate of fire, hundreds of rounds per minute, made open ground, such as no man's land, almost impossible to cross without suffering devastating losses. The defensive advantage they offered entrenched the stalemate, as attacking forces were mowed down by a barrage of bullets. Soldiers often described advancing toward machine guns as walking into the jaws of death, and entire regiments could be wiped out in minutes during an ill-fated assault. Artillery became the defining force of the war. Heavy cannons and howitzers could shell enemy trenches from miles away, turning entire landscapes into shattered wastelands. Barrages were used to soften enemy positions before infantry attacks, but miscalculations or delays often led to tragic consequences, including friendly fire incidents. The psychological effect of constant shelling was immense. The roar of artillery could drown out conversation, rattle teeth, collapse dugouts, and leave soldiers trembling. Many survivors of sustained bombardment developed shell shock, now recognized as a form of post-traumatic stress disorder. Poison gas introduced a new and horrifying dimension to warfare. Chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas were deployed to break the deadlock of trench lines. Gas could seep into trenches, causing blindness, burns, choking, and often slow, agonizing death. Gas masks became a standard part of a soldier's equipment, yet even with protection, exposure could result in long-term respiratory damage or psychological trauma. The fear of invisible gas attacks added to the constant stress of trench life, creating an environment where the line between life and death was tenuous and ever-shifting. Rifles and bayonets remained the backbone of infantry combat. Standard-issue rifles, such as the British Lee Enfield or the German Mauser, were reliable and deadly at moderate ranges. Close-quarters combat in the trenches often involved bayonets, clubs, and grenades, turning brief skirmishes into brutal hand-to-hand encounters. Trench raids were particularly vicious, as soldiers navigated narrow, confined spaces where survival depended on speed, aggression, and luck. Mortars and grenades allowed soldiers to attack the enemy from within their fortifications. Mortars lobbed shells in high arcs into trenches, while hand grenades could clear bunkers or dugouts. Both demanded skill and courage, as miscalculations could endanger one's own comrades. These weapons, though smaller in scale than artillery, were instrumental in incremental gains along the front. Tanks and early armored vehicles, introduced later in the war, were attempts to overcome the impasse of trench lines. The British Mark I tank, first deployed in 1916 during the Battle of the Somme, was slow and mechanically unreliable but symbolized a new era in warfare. Tanks could crush barbed wire, cross trenches, and provide mobile protection for advancing infantry, though their initial impact was limited by mechanical failures and inexperience. The deadly combination of these weapons transformed the Western Front into a landscape of horror. Each advance was measured in yards, each attack a gamble with survival, and every engagement left behind a trail of devastation. The cumulative effect of machine guns, artillery, gas, and small arms contributed to staggering casualty numbers, making the war not only a test of strategy but also of endurance, morale, and human resilience. The Western Front was not just a line on a map, it was a theater of unimaginable suffering, where every mile of territory was contested with human lives. Trench warfare resulted in some of the bloodiest, most prolonged battles in history, each leaving behind staggering casualties and haunting stories of courage, endurance, and despair. One of the earliest large-scale engagements was the First Battle of Ypres, October-November 1914, in Belgium. Both the Allied and German forces sought to secure the strategic town of Ypres, and their clashes quickly devolved into trench stalemate. Soldiers endured incessant shelling, mud, and freezing temperatures. Entire battalions disappeared in hours, swallowed by machine gun fire or artillery barrages. The battle demonstrated the deadly efficiency of modern weapons and the futility of frontal assaults, foreshadowing the grinding nature of trench warfare for years to come. The Battle of Verdun, February–December 1916, became a symbol of French endurance and German determination. Intended as a battle of attrition, Verdun saw nearly 1 million casualties, with French and German soldiers locked in months of relentless combat. The French army's rallying cry, "They shall not pass," epitomized the resolve required to survive the ceaseless bombardments, gas attacks, and infantry assaults. Trenches at Verdun were often little more than muddy graves, where soldiers clung to life amid collapsing dugouts and pervasive disease. Meanwhile, the Battle of the Somme, July and November 1916, highlighted the devastating cost of offensive operations against entrenched positions. The British Army, in an effort to relieve pressure on Verdun, launched a massive assault. The first day alone resulted in nearly 60,000 British casualties, including more than 19,000 killed, the deadliest day in British military history. Tanks were introduced, artillery barrages pounded the enemy, and waves of infantry attempted to cross no man's land. Yet, despite the technological innovations and strategic planning, gains were measured in mere miles, and the human cost was staggering. Soldiers wrote letters home describing the shattered landscape, strewn with corpses, mud, and the relentless cries of the wounded. Passchendaele, Third Battle of Ypres, July and November 1917, exemplified the cruel combination of mud, rain, and modern weaponry. Heavy artillery had churned the fields into a quagmire, turning every step into a battle against the earth itself. Soldiers sank into waist-deep mud, sometimes alongside fallen comrades, unable to advance or retreat. Disease, hypothermia, and exhaustion claimed as many lives as enemy fire. Despite these horrors, the Allied forces pressed on, motivated by duty, orders, and the hope of eventually breaking the stalemate. The human cost of these battles extended far beyond the immediate fatalities. Survivors suffered lifelong physical injuries, from amputations to chronic respiratory damage caused by gas exposure. Psychological trauma, often unrecognized at the time, left deep scars. Letters, diaries, and memoirs reveal the complex emotions of soldiers: fear, hope, camaraderie, despair, and a strange acceptance of death as an everyday companion. Medical personnel, overwhelmed by the sheer number of wounded, worked under unimaginable pressure, often improvising treatments in makeshift hospitals near the front lines. Trench warfare also had a profound effect on families and societies. News of casualty lists, letters from soldiers, and official reports filtered home slowly, often sanitized to preserve morale. Communities lost sons, brothers, and fathers, while soldiers returned physically and emotionally altered, struggling to reintegrate into civilian life. The staggering human toll of the Western Front reshaped national consciousness and left an indelible mark on literature, art, and collective memory. The battles of Ypres, Verdun, the Somme, and Passchendaele were not isolated events, they were episodes in a larger narrative of endurance, strategy, and survival. Each engagement highlighted the deadly interplay between technology, tactics, and human resilience, illustrating the profound tragedy of trench warfare. Soldiers faced unimaginable dangers daily, yet they persisted, driven by duty, camaraderie, and the hope that their suffering might one day contribute to a lasting peace. Trench warfare on the Western Front was not only a battle of soldiers and weapons but also a contest of strategy and command. The stalemate that defined much of the conflict arose from the deadly combination of modern firepower and rigid military thinking. Generals faced the challenge of coordinating massive armies across static lines, while technology had far outpaced traditional tactics. Every offensive required careful planning, yet even the most meticulously designed operations often yielded minimal territorial gains at tremendous human cost. At the heart of trench warfare strategy was the art of attrition. Both sides sought to wear down the enemy's manpower, resources, and morale. Offensive operations, such as those at Verdun and the Somme, were designed not to achieve rapid breakthroughs but to inflict maximum casualties and exhaust the opponent. This strategy was brutal in its simplicity. The side with the greater reserves of men and material would eventually prevail. However, attritional tactics often resulted in staggering losses for only minor advances, cementing the perception that the Western Front was a war of endless slaughter. Commanders employed a range of offensive tactics to attempt breakthroughs. Preliminary artillery bombardments were intended to destroy enemy trenches, cut barbed wire, and weaken defensive positions. Creeping barrages, lines of artillery fire advancing ahead of infantry, were introduced to provide cover and coordination. Specialized units, including engineers and sappers, were tasked with tunneling under enemy lines to plant explosives. Trench raids, patrols, and night attacks aimed to gather intelligence, disrupt enemy operations, or capture prisoners. Despite these innovations, the entrenched defenses, combined with the lethality of machine guns and artillery, made lasting success extremely difficult. Defensive strategy became equally sophisticated. Trenches were designed in multiple layers: frontline, support, and reserve trenches, interconnected by communication trenches. Barbed wire, mines, and machine gun nests created a lethal gauntlet for any attacking force. Observation posts allowed for artillery coordination and early warning of enemy movements. Commanders focused on holding ground rather than advancing, as the cost of failure was immense. Defensive strategies often dictated the tempo of operations, forcing attackers to take enormous risks for even minimal gains. The stalemate on the Western Front persisted for years due to several factors. First, technology favored defense. Machine guns, rapid-firing artillery, and barbed wire made frontal assaults deadly. Second, logistics constrained operations. Moving men, supplies, and ammunition across shell-torn landscapes was slow and dangerous, limiting the speed of advances. Third, entrenched command structures and conservative tactics often failed to adapt to the realities of modern warfare. Generals, influenced by doctrine and previous military experience, sometimes underestimated the destructive potential of enemy firepower, resulting in repeated, costly offensives. Attempts to break the deadlock were numerous but often met with mixed results. The introduction of tanks in 1916 offered a glimmer of hope, providing mobile protection and the ability to crush barbed wire, but early models were slow, mechanically unreliable, and vulnerable to artillery. Chemical weapons, while terrifying and psychologically devastating, rarely achieved decisive outcomes. Coordination between infantry, artillery, and new technologies was difficult, particularly under fire, highlighting the limitations of command and communication on the front lines. Despite the stagnation, both sides experimented constantly, learning and adapting. Lessons from failed offensives influenced future operations, refining artillery techniques, improving infantry tactics, and integrating combined arms approaches. The eventual breakthroughs in 1918, during the German Spring Offensive and Allied 100 Days Offensive, demonstrated the potential of coordinated strategy, mobility, and logistics to overcome the static horrors of trench warfare. Yet for years, soldiers endured the deadly rhythm of attack and counterattack, inching forward at immense cost. The Western Front stalemate was a crucible of strategy, technology, and human endurance. Commanders wrestled with the limits of firepower and the challenge of breaking fortified lines, while soldiers bore the daily burden of deadly defenses and grueling labor. Trench warfare demanded not only physical courage but also adaptability and perseverance, as men and machines were tested to their limits in a conflict defined by its unyielding nature and the relentless pursuit of strategic advantage. Life in the trenches was a constant battle against not only enemy fire but also the environment, disease, and the unrelenting strain on the human mind. Soldiers faced conditions that were almost unimaginable: mud that swallowed boots, water-filled dugouts, rotting corpses, and the constant proximity of death. Survival depended on vigilance, adaptability, and sheer endurance. Sanitation and disease were persistent challenges. Trenches were often poorly drained, turning into muddy swamps after rain. Standing water led to trench foot, a painful and sometimes gangrenous condition affecting the feet, which could result in amputation if untreated. Dysentery and other gastrointestinal illnesses spread rapidly, fueled by contaminated water and inadequate hygiene. Typhus, influenza, and respiratory infections were common, exacerbated by overcrowding and exposure to cold, wet conditions. Medical officers worked tirelessly, but supplies were limited, and treatment often consisted of basic cleaning, bandages, or rudimentary medications. Rats and vermin were another daily torment. Large, disease-carrying rats thrived on human waste, food scraps, and decomposing bodies, sometimes growing as large as cats. Lice were a constant nuisance, burrowing into clothing and blankets, causing itching, skin infections, and the spread of disease. Soldiers attempted to delouse clothing, but the infestation was nearly impossible to eradicate, contributing to constant discomfort and stress. Psychological trauma, though poorly understood at the time, was widespread. Soldiers were exposed to near-constant bombardment, the screams of wounded comrades, and the sight of decaying bodies. The term shell shock emerged to describe the symptoms: tremors, panic attacks, mutism, and an inability to function in combat. Many soldiers suffered silently, fearing stigma or dismissal as cowards. The cumulative mental strain of months in the trenches created a generation scarred by war, with consequences that extended long after the armistice. Nutrition and food were another source of hardship. Soldiers relied on rations, often consisting of hard biscuits, tinned meat, or canned vegetables. Fresh food was rare, and malnutrition, combined with physical exertion, weakened immunity and increased susceptibility to illness. Efforts to improve diet, including supplementing with chocolate, canned fruit, or local produce, offered some relief but could not compensate for the overall poor nutrition. Weather and exposure compounded the misery. Winters brought freezing temperatures, snow, and frostbite. Summers brought heat, flies, and the stench of stagnant water. Soldiers were constantly wet or sweaty, conditions that aggravated disease and physical exhaustion. Clothing and blankets, often inadequate or damaged, provided limited protection against the elements. Adaptation became essential. Soldiers improvised drainage, built makeshift shelters, and used ingenuity to cope with the relentless environmental challenges. Coping mechanisms and camaraderie were vital for survival. Humor, storytelling, and small acts of defiance provided psychological relief. Letters from home, rare entertainment, and shared rituals helped maintain morale. Soldiers developed tight-knit bonds, often stronger than family ties, which provided emotional support in a world defined by death and destruction. These human connections were essential for survival, offering fleeting comfort amid the horrors of trench life. Despite these hardships, soldiers continued to perform their duties. Guard rotations, sentry duty, trench repairs, and offensive operations demanded vigilance and courage. Each day was a test of physical endurance and mental fortitude. The trench was more than a battlefield, it was a crucible, shaping the character and resilience of those who endured its relentless challenges. Trench warfare was not static in the sense of human ingenuity. Both sides continually sought ways to adapt to the deadly stalemate, employing new technologies, tactics, and methods to gain advantage over entrenched enemies. These innovations ranged from weaponry to battlefield medicine, and they often determined survival as much as courage or numbers. Tactical adaptations became essential. Commanders learned that mass infantry assaults across no man's land often ended in disaster. They began to integrate combined arms approaches, coordinating artillery, infantry, engineers, and, later, tanks. The creeping barrage, an artillery technique in which shells advanced just ahead of infantry, allowed soldiers to follow a protective curtain of fire, reducing exposure to machine guns. Patrols and trench raids were refined to gather intelligence, disrupt enemy positions, and maintain morale without committing entire regiments to futile frontal attacks. Mining and tunneling were particularly inventive adaptations. Engineers dug tunnels under enemy lines to plant explosives, aiming to destroy fortifications or create breaches. The Battle of Messines in 1917 famously utilized 19 massive mines detonated simultaneously, leveling German positions and demonstrating the destructive potential of subterranean warfare. Tunneling was dangerous and exhausting work, often conducted under the threat of enemy detection, underground flooding, or collapse. Chemical warfare forced adaptation as well. Gas masks and protective gear became standard issue after the first large-scale chlorine attacks in 1915 at Ypres. Soldiers underwent training in rapid deployment of masks, and trench designs were modified to include dugouts with air filtration. While the use of poison gas remained ethically and tactically controversial, it prompted innovation in both defense and medical treatment. Tank development and mechanized warfare offered a glimpse of future combat. The British Mark I, introduced in 1916, demonstrated the potential of armored vehicles to cross trenches, crush barbed wire, and shield infantry from small arms fire. Early tanks were slow, prone to mechanical failure, and limited in number, but they forced enemy forces to rethink defensive strategies. By the war's end, tanks had become an integral part of offensive planning, signaling a shift toward combined arms mobility. Communications innovations were crucial in coordinating complex operations. Signal flags, runners, telephones, and later wireless sets allowed commanders to relay information across trenches and artillery positions. These systems were often unreliable due to shell damage or enemy interference, but even imperfect communications could mean the difference between a successful assault and catastrophic failure. Coordination between infantry and artillery became increasingly sophisticated, as generals learned the importance of timing and precision. Medical and logistical adaptations helped soldiers survive longer in the trenches. Field hospitals, triage systems, and motorized ambulances improved casualty care. Sanitation measures, such as drainage of trenches, latrines, and improved water supply, reduced disease incidents. Soldiers were trained in basic first aid, bandaging, and stretcher drills, reflecting a growing recognition that survival depended not just on combat skill but also on health and hygiene. Even small, improvised innovations could have a significant impact. Soldiers created periscopes to observe enemy lines without exposing themselves, makeshift duckboards to navigate muddy trenches, and rudimentary shelters to survive bombardments. These adaptations reflected both creativity and the harsh realities of life at the front, where every advantage could mean survival. Trench warfare, therefore, was as much a story of innovation and human ingenuity as it was of suffering. The challenges of static, deadly conflict forced armies to experiment, adapt, and evolve, laying the groundwork for modern combined arms tactics. Survival depended not only on courage but also on understanding, anticipation, and the ability to exploit every technological and tactical advantage in a landscape where a single mistake could be fatal. While the trenches defined the soldiers' immediate reality, the war above and beyond them shaped every decision, movement, and survival on the Western Front. Artillery and aviation became dominant forces, transforming the battlefield into a three-dimensional theater of destruction, surveillance, and psychological terror. Artillery was the ultimate weapon of trench warfare. It accounted for the majority of casualties on the Western Front and defined the rhythm of attacks and defenses. Heavy howitzers, field guns, and mortars pounded enemy lines, sometimes continuously for days. Barrages were designed to destroy fortifications, cut barbed wire, and demoralize defenders. Soldiers described standing under the sky while it fell in fire, as shells reduced trenches, bunkers, and surrounding terrain to splintered mud and chaos. The psychological effect was profound. Constant bombardment induced fear, insomnia, and shell shock, eroding morale even before infantry assaults began. Artillery was also a precision tool, though accuracy was often limited by technology. Forward observers, stationed in makeshift towers or on captured high ground, relayed information to batteries, adjusting fire with maps, coordinates, and signal flares. Innovations like the creeping barrage, a line of artillery fire moving just ahead of advancing troops, were attempts to coordinate movement with destructive power, minimizing exposure to machine guns. Despite careful planning, miscalculations could devastate friendly troops, highlighting the precarious balance between firepower and human survival. Aviation emerged as a crucial element of warfare, initially for reconnaissance, and later for combat. Early airplanes were fragile, open-cockpit biplanes, used to observe enemy trench layouts, troop movements, and artillery positions. Pilots provided essential intelligence, mapping enemy defenses with remarkable accuracy, often flying under fire from ground gunners and enemy aircraft. Reconnaissance reports enabled commanders to plan artillery barrages, troop movements, and attacks with unprecedented detail. By 1915 to 1916, air combat evolved rapidly. Fighter planes engaged in dogfights to secure control of the skies, protecting reconnaissance aircraft and providing support for ground operations. Observation balloons, tethered near the front lines, served as stationary platforms for artillery spotting, although they were vulnerable to incendiary attacks. The presence of aircraft added a new layer of threat and opportunity to trench warfare, influencing morale and strategy alike. Soldiers on the ground looked skyward with both hope for intelligence and support, and dread, knowing that aerial observers could pinpoint their position to enemy guns. Combined effects of artillery and air power created a dynamic battlefield beyond the trenches themselves. A well-coordinated artillery and aerial attack could devastate an enemy sector, destroy fortifications, and create gaps for infantry advances. Conversely, failing to integrate these elements often meant that troops faced well-prepared defenders in a landscape of shattered earth and uncut wire, with catastrophic casualties. The omnipresence of artillery and aviation reshaped daily life in the trenches. Soldiers learned to identify incoming shells, distinguish between artillery types, and take cover during bombardments. Listening posts, dugouts, and improvised shelters became essential for survival. The deafening noise and relentless threat created constant stress, with soldiers often describing the battlefield as a ceaseless storm of fire that blurred days into nights. By the war's later years, technological advancements further enhanced the role of air and artillery. Observation techniques became more precise, artillery calibers and range increased, and coordination with ground forces improved. Pilots developed specialized bombing techniques, strafing runs, and aerial photography, all contributing to a more sophisticated, integrated battlefield. Yet, despite these innovations, the fundamental horror of trench warfare remained unchanged. Human life continued to be measured in yards gained, with every advance paid for in blood. Artillery and aviation, therefore, were not merely tools of destruction but instruments that defined strategy, psychology, and survival on the Western Front. They magnified the lethality of entrenched positions, shaped offensive and defensive planning, and left an enduring imprint on both soldiers' lives and the evolution of modern warfare. By 1918, after nearly 4 years of stalemate, exhaustion, and attrition, both sides sought decisive action. The cumulative effect of relentless fighting, new tactics, and technological adaptation set the stage for the final phase of the war, which would finally break the seemingly immovable Western Front. The German Spring Offensive, Kaiserschlacht, launched in March 1918, was Germany's desperate bid to win the war before American forces could fully deploy. Utilizing stormtrooper tactics, rapid infiltration methods, and concentrated artillery barrages, the Germans achieved initial breakthroughs in sectors of the front. Trenches that had seemed impregnable for years were overrun within hours, as specially trained units bypassed strongpoints and attacked rear positions. The offensive demonstrated both innovation and desperation, but it ultimately overextended German lines and exhausted troops already weakened by years of blockade and attrition. Allied forces, bolstered by fresh American divisions and reinforced British and French troops, responded with defensive depth strategies. Instead of rigidly holding every trench line, commanders allowed the enemy to advance into prepared zones, then counterattacked once supply lines were strained and soldiers fatigued. This approach reduced casualties, absorbed enemy momentum, and set the stage for decisive counteroffensives. The 100 Days Offensive, August to November 1918, marked the final coordinated Allied push. Utilizing combined arms tactics perfected over years, infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft operated in unison. Barrages were synchronized with advancing infantry, tanks crushed barbed wire, and aircraft provided reconnaissance and close support. Troop morale, logistics, and coordination had finally reached a level sufficient to break the stalemate that had dominated the Western Front since 1914. Key battles during this period, such as Amiens, Saint-Quentin, and the Meuse-Argonne offensive, showcased the culmination of 4 years of learning and adaptation. Advances of several miles, considered monumental in previous years, were now achieved more quickly, with fewer casualties relative to earlier offensives. Soldiers, while still enduring artillery, machine gun fire, and treacherous terrain, finally experienced a tangible sense of progress. These victories contributed to the rapid collapse of German morale and the eventual request for an armistice. The human cost, however, remained staggering. Millions of soldiers had perished or been wounded, countless communities were devastated, and the psychological scars endured. Trenches, once thought permanent, were abandoned, leaving behind a scarred, cratered landscape. Soldiers reflected on both the futility and heroism of trench warfare, months of waiting, enduring, and fighting in conditions that seemed to defy reason, culminating in the final, exhausting push toward victory. The collapse of the Western Front demonstrated that innovation, coordination, and fresh manpower could overcome even the most fortified defensive systems. Yet it also underscored the enormous human toll of static, attritional warfare. The combination of endurance, strategy, and technology finally ended the deadlock, but the lessons of trench warfare would resonate far beyond 1918, influencing military thought and shaping the future of combat. The trenches of the Western Front were more than mere ditches in the earth, they were crucibles that shaped a generation, defined modern warfare, and left a lasting imprint on history. The legacy of trench warfare is multifaceted, encompassing psychological, social, technological, and strategic dimensions. Psychological legacy: soldiers who survived the trenches returned home profoundly changed. The experiences of constant danger, death, and squalor left deep emotional scars. Many suffered from shell shock, now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Nightmares, anxiety, and difficulty reintegrating into civilian life were common. Literature, memoirs, and art from the post-war period reveal the mental toll, haunting memories of comrades lost, the stench and mud of no man's land, and the senseless carnage that defined daily life. The psychological impact of trench warfare transformed not only veterans but also national consciousness, creating a somber awareness of the human cost of modern industrialized war. Social and cultural legacy: trench warfare reshaped societies. Families lost sons, fathers, and brothers, communities grappled with the staggering scale of casualties, and a generation of young men faced disruption in education, careers, and personal lives. The shared trauma of soldiers and civilians fostered a new cultural reflection on war. Commemorations, memorials, and literature emerged to honor the sacrifices and warn against future conflict. The trenches became a symbol of endurance, suffering, and the futility of war, influencing art, poetry, and public discourse for decades. Technological legacy: the static nature of trench warfare spurred innovation in military technology. Tanks, improved artillery, aircraft, chemical weapons, and communication systems all evolved rapidly as armies sought to break the deadlock. Techniques perfected on the Western Front, including combined arms tactics, creeping barrages, and mechanized infantry support, informed future military doctrine. While the horrors of the trenches were unique to World War I, the technological lessons learned shaped combat strategies in subsequent conflicts, from World War II to modern mechanized warfare. Strategic legacy. Trench warfare underscored the limitations of attritional strategies and the importance of mobility, coordination, and logistics. Commanders learned that rigid adherence to traditional tactics against modern firepower resulted in massive casualties with little gain. The war forced the development of more flexible operational planning, emphasizing intelligence, reconnaissance, and adaptability. These lessons transformed military thinking, influencing both training and doctrine in the years following the Great War. Environmental and physical legacy. The Western Front left a lasting scar on the landscape. Fields were cratered by artillery, forests flattened, and rivers polluted by chemical residues. Some battlefields, particularly in France and Belgium, remained dangerous for decades due to unexploded ordnance, a grim reminder of the war's intensity. The physical remnants of trenches, bunkers, and destroyed villages serve today as historical markers and memorials, preserving the memory of sacrifice and endurance. In sum, the legacy of the trenches is a tapestry of human resilience, technological progress, and tragic loss. They encapsulate the paradox of modern warfare. The extraordinary capacity for human innovation and bravery exists alongside unprecedented destruction and suffering. The Western Front shaped a generation of soldiers, influenced nations, and left lessons for military strategists, historians, and society as a whole. The story of the trenches is thus not only a tale of horror but also a chronicle of endurance, adaptation, and the profound costs of war.